There's a discourse that has started online over this video, and I'll play the video and then tell you what makes it interesting, because the interesting part will not be immediately obvious to you. When you first see it, you're going to say, this is the least interesting thing I've ever seen. But it's a very quick little clip. Here it is. Now, for those listening to the audio podcast, that's a video of a person, a man, we're led to believe, sitting alone at a restaurant and crying while he eats his mashed potatoes. I think it's mashed potatoes. I don't know. And the caption on the screen says, "You don't know lonely until you have to take yourself for that meal alone, because sitting in a room with strangers is better than sitting in your own thoughts in an empty room." Now, at first blush, nothing too fascinating going on here. This is someone performing sadness for the camera, selling their tears for clicks. Nothing more cynical or less sympathetic than somebody who takes a selfie video of themselves crying. Okay, you deserve no sympathy if you do that. I'm sorry. Anyone who, if you're that desperate for sympathy, then you shouldn't get any sympathy. It only encourages you at that point. But this is especially strange behavior for a man, because what kind of a man cries about eating alone at a restaurant? Eating alone at a restaurant is great. I mean, it's one of the life's simplest joys, as every man knows. I've never known a man who would think to himself, "Oh no, I get a quiet meal at a nice restaurant by myself. What a tragedy. This is awful. A nice meal, no one's talking to me, and I just get to sit here in quiet. Well, this is the worst thing that's ever happened to me." I've never known a man who would think that. And besides, what kind of man would film this emotional meltdown and post it to TikTok? I mean, what kind of man would look back at a video of himself crying and say, "You know what? I need everyone to see this. I need everyone. I got to show the world. The whole world needs to see this. Hey, world, look at me crying here." What kind of man would do that? Well, as it turns out, the kind of man who does that is the kind of man who is not a man. This is, as you may have already been able to tell, apparently a female to male transgender. It is a woman who, quote unquote, transitioned to a man. That's what kind of makes it interesting. You know, we always talk about how trans people will never actually be the sex they're trying to be, which is obviously true. But it's also true that, especially in the case of a trans-identified female, which we don't talk about as often, we usually talk about the other way, you know, male-identified, trans-identified males. But in particular, when it comes to trans-identified females, they're never going to be a man, never going to be a male. But they may get to experience a small sliver of the thing. They'll never be the thing they want to be, but they may get close enough to stand in its shadow, ever so briefly. Because if a woman goes through with the medical transition, she probably will be allotted some tiny portion of the social experience of being a man. She won't be a man at all. Pre-transition, she was a billion light years away from literally being a man. Post-transition, she is still a billion light years away. But because of the way she looks, she will perhaps catch a hazy glimpse into the world of men. She'll get a small, diluted sip of the cup of manhood. And invariably, this small sip will prove to be way too much. It's like drinking a small sip of gasoline. It burns her, it destroys her, it eats away at her insides. And we've seen this many times before. We've seen many videos of these trans-identified females who, quote unquote, became men and are not happy at all, are devastated when they've discovered what it's like. Ellen Page is perhaps the most prominent example of this. It's a little bit like when I was 10 years old and I bugged my dad for a sip of his beer, because it looks delicious in the glass, right? It's like this froth. It looks like a root beer float or something in the glass. Beer does. And so to my surprise, my dad said, "Yeah," and then watched with amusement as I took one sip and recoiled in disgust. I mean, it looked so tempting from the outside, but then I drank it and discovered that it was bitter and foul. And I asked my dad, I said, "Wait, that's what it tastes like? And you actually like this stuff? How?" And that's the same question that women like the one in the video or Ellen Page ask after they get the tiniest little sip of the male experience. Wait, that's what this is? And you guys like this? What women don't realize is that the male experience is one of profound isolation. To be a man is to be isolated and alone in a very real sense. Now, we don't talk about it, partly because we don't fully realize it ourselves in the same way that a fish doesn't realize he's in water. We also don't talk about it because it would just be whining, but it's true. I mean, it's lonely to be a man, and it's a kind of loneliness that women, as the softer, more sociable, more relational sex, simply aren't built to endure. Now, when I say that men are isolated, I'm not even talking about the relentless demonization of men in our society. That obviously has an isolating effect. That's part of it. But this is even deeper than that. Men are isolated by nature. It's our lot in life. Single men, in particular, walk through a world where they are not really noticed or valued unless they can do or provide something. And then their value only goes as far as the thing they're doing or providing. Now, for a young woman, especially if she's modestly attractive, which just really means for a young woman, don't be fat. I mean, if she's not fat, then she is, in the eyes of many men, of plenty of men, will count as modestly attractive. And so for her, it's different. People will notice her and be nice to her just because she's there. And she doesn't need to do anything. It's just not that way for men. To be a single man in today's world, in any world, but especially in today's world, it's about the loneliest thing. And single women may be lonely too, but they typically have many more friends. They navigate a world that treats them nicely, that goes out of its way to make them feel valued. That's not the case for men. A man may have a couple of friends, he may have none at all, but he lives in a world that just doesn't care how he feels. Either way. Now, once a man is married and has children, he's no longer alone. A measure of the isolation has been taken away, but he is called to be the emotional rock for the family, which means, as we've discussed before, that he can't be entirely vulnerable. He cannot unload all of his stresses and frustrations all the time. Doesn't mean he has to keep everything to himself, but there are many things that he just has to keep to himself. He's the leader of the home, and there is a kind of loneliness that comes with leadership, as anyone who's ever been in a leadership position knows, right? And this is how men were made. Men are the ones who are called to go off and die in war. Every society in human history since the dawn of time has treated men as expendable in a way that women are not. I mean, even now, if you hear about, in our enlightened age, in our enlightened egalitarian age, if you hear about casualties in war, you'll be much more outraged and heartbroken to hear about 10 women and children dying than to hear that 1,000 men died, right? Human civilization is built and maintained by men who are willing to die. There's never a lot of gratitude shown to these men. These days, there's almost none at all. And instead, the men who build civilization are demonized and scapegoated. 100-year-old World War II veterans look around and see that everything they fought to achieve has been squandered. Is that isolating? Of course it is. Men have always done the thankless tasks in society, the dirty and dangerous and unsightly things. And now the thanklessness has turned to outright scorn. Now, the good news for men is that we're made for this. We learn to love our lot in life. We don't expect gratitude from the world because we never really received it. We've never been in a world where people just are nice to you all the time and want to constantly make you feel cherished and valued. It's the old stereotype about you compare a pastor's sermon on Mother's Day to the one he gives on Father's Day, and Mother's Day, it's always like telling women how wonderful they are. And Father's Day, it's always, hey, get it together, guys. You're failing your families. And, that's real. That's the way society approaches the two sexes. And so this is all we know. Now, hopefully we get married and have children. And if we do, that's almost all the social connection we need. I mean, a man would be fine going to work and coming home to his wife and children and having no friends or connections outside of that. In fact, a man even dreams of deeper isolation. Part of him longs for the pioneer days when he could take his family out into the wilderness and build a life alone out there, away from everybody. But he's not living in those days, and his wife wants him to have friends, so he maintains a few friendships with other men who he sees on occasion, which is good and healthy because men should have friends, absolutely. The fraternal connection between men is important to maintain, but the point is that most men, once they have a family, could survive just fine and even be happy with no friends and no connection to anybody else. A man's friendships are also not nearly as intense as a woman's. A man may have a friend that he talks to like once every 6 months and sees even less frequently than that, and that's fine. Now, my wife has friends that she calls and talks to every day. I've never met an adult man who talks to another man on the phone every day or anything close to that. I was like, if we talk on the phone, then like I'll talk to you again in 9.5 months, maybe. But we don't need that. What can we possibly have to say to each other every day? If a man called me just to check in and then called the next day to check in again, I would assume he was having some kind of mental breakdown. That's just not how men are. Like, we don't need that much communication and connection, at least not that intensely. So this is the good news. Society needs men to be more isolated, less emotional, less desirous of human connection, and men on average are all of those things. But what happens when a woman tries to come play in our sandbox? What happens when she takes a small dose of our medicine? What happens when she tries to carry the burden of manhood? Well, exactly what you would expect. I mean, it breaks her. Her knees buckle, her back gives out. She wasn't prepared. She couldn't have been. Now, I'm not just talking about women who are trans. This includes women who try to play the role of men in any form, women who take on combat roles in the military, police officers, try to be ruthless like corporate girl bosses, all that stuff. In all these cases, women are trying to do what men are uniquely built to do, not just physically, but emotionally and psychologically. Now, about that video of the trans female, somebody on X put it this way, that this is a woman experiencing male social isolation without the male psychology that makes it survivable. And I think the account's name was Hunter Ash, I think, said that. And that about sums it up. This is perhaps the deepest truth about the trans phenomenon, which is rarely said. You know, we always talk about how a man cannot become a woman and a woman cannot become a man, which is true. But what we don't say to the person trying to cross the divide from one sex to the other is this: you can't have what you want, but also you don't really want it.